Hello, I'm Bob the Booker and welcome to my channel, and today I just wanted to talk about the books that I've been reading this week. And it's been a fun one, but it's also been a week where I've not, I don't know, I've read bits and bobs here and there, and audiobooks have been my friend for most of this. But let's get started talking about some of these books, and I hope you've been having a good one too. First up, The Extinction of Irena by Jennifer Croft. And Jennifer Croft, I mentioned last week as well when I was talking about Flights and Two Sherpas. This is her first, I believe, novel, well, sort of second novel. She had Homesick, which was a memoir that then sort of became a novel, and it had this sort of auto-fiction quality to it. So this is a kind of novel in a different sense, I guess, but it still has a lot of there's a lot of crossover potentially with Jennifer Croft's real life, in the sense that this book largely focuses around a group of characters who are translators, and particularly translators for a Polish author who may he's suspected to win the Nobel Prize at points in the book. Olga Tokarczuk, being a Polish author who won the Nobel Prize recently and has been translated into English by Jennifer Croft. So there's a kind of fun overlap anyway. But I just really, really enjoyed what this book does. I think it's really clever and really intelligent and sort of funny and silly at times, but also really quite profound. And the core idea is there is this Polish author is sort of this very esoteric figure almost. They publish these books, and loads of these translators think that she's a genius, and she's sort of hand selected most of the translators in various languages, and she insists that when they're with her they only speak Polish to each other, partly as well so they don't seem to have any other conversations outside. And already this is kind of a fun concept, and kind of because we sort of see how this Polish author is so much at the heart of everything. And Irena is this sort of godlike figure in their world. But she goes missing at one point in the book, and then the translators basically have to fend for themselves and work out what's going on. But what I thought was so clever in many ways is the way that the book takes that initial idea and then adds a sort of meta level to it. So this whole book, the idea is that The Extinction of Irena is a book written in Spanish by one of the translators who was there, talking about her experiences. It is then translated into English, maybe written in Polish, but either way, it's translated into English by a character who is featured in the book. So this character is translating sentences and paragraphs that often refer to her herself. And so it will say something like, Alexis scoffed. And in the footnotes, she'll say, well, I didn't quite scoff. I think that's unfair. And you can sense this sort of animosity between these two characters where, you know, the character, the translator who's writing the book will say, oh, well, she, you know, I could see her looking at this, or I saw how nobody laughed at her joke. And the translator is there like, hey, wait, like, what's this about? Like, why all this like hostility? And I think it's so fun to watch how this book plays with perspective in that sense, because a lot of the time you forget that you're reading a translation of this other book, and then the translator cuts back in and you have this little flashback. And also right at the beginning of the book, before the translators introduce each other by proper name, they are just referred to by the language they translate into. So, you know, it'll be like, oh, Serbian and Slovenian went down to the road, went down to this place and did this. And, you know, it's this really silly, fun thing throughout the book, you know, like, oh, Swedish did this. And I just really love how this book plays with that kind of perspective, but also tells this really quite gripping and intense story. It's just it kind of, lots of parts of my brain were kind of fizzling throughout this book, just how clever it is and how silly it is at times. It allows itself to be very fun and playful, but also it's this really dark, twisty story at the same time. So I absolutely loved it. I think this is I feel like I've said this already about The Night Alphabet by Joel Taylor as well, but a nice early contender for a book of the year, I think already. I just think this is excellent. Next up, another book that I really greatly enjoyed and will probably also be high up in my list at the end of the year already, Lucy Jones with Matrescence. And so this is a book that was longlisted for the Women's Prize non-fiction list. And that's the first time that we've had, sorry, sudden massive change in light there. The sun is hidden. Matrescence is a book that really interrogates a lot of myths that we currently have, particularly about pregnancy. And it does it through Lucy Jones talking a lot about her own experiences. So matrescence, this idea, this concept, is that like we have adolescence and we have things like puberty, and we have all these other markers that we use to talk about like infants, like infancy and stuff like that. We have all these other words to talk about how there's a sort of a big stage in development that suddenly happens that changes body chemistry and brain chemistry and all these other things. And she talks about how with matrescence, and parescence does apparently also exist, but matrescence, the sort of the process of of becoming pregnant and of giving birth and of raising a child affects brain chemistry in various ways. So not only in terms of what it does inside the brain sort of physiologically in terms of the amygdala, kind of parts of the amygdala expanding or whatever else. It also massively affects how we interpret things around us. So there's that common thing about when people fall pregnant, I should correct myself on this. When people become pregnant, fall pregnant is a horribly outdated phrase. When people become pregnant, there is something that changes with the sense of smell. So lots of people report that that suddenly all smells get really amped up, and Lucy Jones talks about her own experiences of this as well, but actually how it goes even further. For her, it wasn't even just I can smell that sandwich that someone's eating 10 meters away. It was also the associations that started to form with some of those things as well. So it will be a sandwich, but the sandwich will also remind her of a thing, and it'll also have a color associated with it and all these other things. And it's fascinating kind of what this does to brain chemistry. But she also in this book makes a really solid and powerful and compelling argument about how distrust, particularly of women when it comes to pain, is a regular thing in kind of in sort of reports of sort of childbirth and various other things. So actually there are so many other impacts of the wider world, and she sort of takes almost an ecological lens at times of looking at how the wider ecology of the natural world is often reliant on all these things kind of being involved with each other and kind of intersecting. And actually, why is it that we don't think of pregnancy in similar terms? You know, why is it that we don't think actually about like mercury levels? You know, we tell expectant parents, particularly people, you know, like childbearing people, to avoid things like fish, because that often triggers sickness for a lot of people. But actually, people in areas where fish is one of the only things around, you know, so she particularly talks about Inuit people. Actually, they are perhaps consuming a really high level of mercury, partly through pollution and partly through these other things. So she really looks at everything as this sort of big interconnected web. And it's absolutely fascinating. I think this is a really special non-fiction book in many ways, because I think there's something so compelling about her personal story combined with the science of it, combined with the sort of ecological wider picture and all of these other factors all put in together. And I just think this book is so interesting. Yeah, I'm really intrigued by so much about it. And it kind of is one of those books that sort of spawns like a million rabbit holes of like, oh, I want to go and explore what this thing is. And now I'm really curious about Matrescence and, you know, all these other things. Really fascinating book. And I totally see why it made it onto the long list. Next up, Rememberings by Sinead O'Connor. So obviously we lost Sinead O'Connor fairly recently. It wasn't too long ago. And the thing a big thing that came out of that was this sort of real feeling that actually many of us didn't fully know Sinead, or we sort of thought we had an image of her. You know, we think of her in relation to things like Nothing Compares to You, and we maybe think about her tearing up the picture of the Pope. But actually there's so much more that happened in her life and in her career as well. And Rememberings is so interesting, I think, because she writes a lot of this book in a very childlike way, not in terms of herself, you know, like, that's not an insult to the writing, but as in she is looking back at times in her life when she was a child, and she's writing in this very childlike way of, oh, this man asks me to do this thing and I'm not quite sure what that is, and then this thing happened and I go over here and somebody tells me this and my dad is very angry, and she has this sort of this really interesting way of writing it, and it's heartbreaking because you sort of do realize obviously how much of her life we didn't know about, which is also fair, you know, that's, she has obviously, you know, she had every right to be a private person, but it's so interesting because I think almost everybody's image of Sinead O'Connor is the kind of the narrative that was created for her rather than by her, and so it's really interesting to sort of hear her words, and I mean it feels more heartbreaking reading this after her passing. Yeah, it's really yeah, it's really quite beautiful. I mean, I think at times, you know, it can sort of meander a teeny bit, and in some ways that's fine. I'm willing to go with her on that journey because, you know, it's so interesting to hear her perspective, particularly all these things, you know, these passions, these joys that she has, and you know, that we didn't necessarily always know about because we had all these other things that we were thinking about her instead. So yeah, really interesting to hear her side. And last but not least, Heather McCalden with The Observable Universe. So this is a non-fiction book from Fitzcarraldo, tie back in with Fitzhuary, which is just finished. Fitzhuary's all year round, really. But The Observable Universe, apparently I can't, Observable Universe. Try saying that 3 times while drunk. Is a book all about, it's quite an interesting patchwork of a book, and I'm always really fascinated by books that do this. I don't know what this typing motion is. So she takes sort of personal memoir about her own life. She takes a sort of, and particularly how that intersects with HIV/AIDS epidemic. So she talks about, she lost both of her parents to AIDS and to sort of AIDS-related illnesses, and this book is sort of partly her writing about that, partly her trying to understand the wider epidemic of HIV and AIDS, and trying to really understand the crisis, trying to understand what her parents would have been feeling, what the world would have been like while her parents were experiencing that. And then a sort of wider thing now of her trying to connect the dots with viruses and the modern world and all these other things. And I'm always so interested about these ideas of how people sort of take this one starting point and kind of pull in sort of 47 different things from around and kind of try to understand things through those lenses. I think that's fascinating. And it's also something I've come to expect from Fitzcarraldo, of these sort of very interesting non-fiction books that are just these really interesting explorations, and they don't need to find an answer. They don't need to be a perfect summary of something. They can leave the door kind of half open, or they can leave a question mark at the end. And I think that's really quite interesting. And so, yeah, I just thought this was a really interesting book and a really interesting way of approaching such a broad range of topics as well. So those are the books that I've read this week. A fun and weird mix, and it's been been lovely to read some of these books, and particularly to really just realize how much great stuff is being released all the time. Like, there is just so much great work coming out constantly, and trying to keep on top of it is a fool's errand, but it's a really fun thing to try and do at the same time. You know, there are so many great things. So yeah, really delighted to have been reading them this week. This week. There's also now a helicopter randomly. Apparently it's coming for me. Let's see. Take care, and I hope you all have a wonderful week, and have had a good week this week as well. Take care and speak to you all soon. Bye bye.